First of all, thank you all for coming along. I hope that you haven't come here under a misapprehension in terms of what I'm going to speak about, because actually I always love, I really look forward every year, twice a year now, to this annual release. It's one of the most enjoyable aspects of my job. It's, I suppose, for me as a journalist, it's looking out from government to the outside. A lot of what I do is looking into government from the outside, trying to work out what's going on. This is the opposite. It's trying to see how government are trying to, for instance, maybe try to plug a leak to a journalist at the Irish Times in 1989 or whatever. And it's a fascinating, I suppose, pulling together of those two aspects of what I do. Unfortunately, this year, this whole RHI scandal blew up in the middle of the week that we were meant to be looking at these papers, so I unfortunately didn't get anywhere near as much time to go through them as I would normally do. So I will speak a little bit generally about the annual release, and then I'll speak about a few of the stories that I did pick up on, and Eamon has been through them in much more detail. So we'll have a lot more to say about what actually happened in the files that are here today. I suppose in general, some people might question what the value is of releasing these documents. There's a lot of time involved for the staff here going through them. They have to decide whether each document should be released in full, whether it would endanger someone's life if, for instance, it mentions that they were an informer, if it mentions something about their time in prison and they're still alive, etc., etc., and obviously less significant cases where they may decide and we may dispute as to whether something should be blacked out. I think that there really is very significant value to what happens here. Some people might think at a time when the health service is under pressure, when budgets are being cut, should we actually fund this by government? And I think that actually what we have here is, I suppose, something which lets us take a long view of politics in Northern Ireland. A lot of what happens in my job is very immediate. It is breaking news, it is the BBC News channel, it's the internet, it's Twitter, it's really instantaneous news, opinion, analysis, whatever, and sometimes we don't have very much time to stop and look back and see things in their full context. And if we take, for instance, the DUP and Sinn Féin, who are now obviously the dominant political forces in Northern Ireland, sometimes when we report on them on a daily basis, we forget, I suppose, where they have come from. People you will very often hear on programmes like Talkback and the Nolan Show saying, you know, they really haven't changed, they are still saying the same things they've always said, etc., etc. Actually, when you look into these documents, you find that there have been massive changes there. The DUP just a few weeks ago nodded through the Assembly a piece of legislation which retrospectively gives pardons to gay men who were convicted in Northern Ireland under the previous law which outlawed homosexuality. You know, in these files we see them vigorously campaigning against that law being repealed. I mean, that might seem like a very small, a very insignificant change unless that directly impacts you, but there are all sorts of changes like that which we see when we look this far back in history. And of course, as the release is getting closer and closer to the present day, we're now under a 20-year rule. Those changes in many cases impact on people who are still involved in politics. So for instance, one of the stories from this year's release, which in some ways was not that massively revelatory. It didn't say anything that wasn't, I suppose, massively well known at the time, but I thought it was fascinating, and it was about Mitchell McLaughlin, who at that point was a Sinn Féin councillor on Derry City Council. He was really, I suppose, one of the mould breakers for Sinn Féin. He had just come into elected politics. The government was still trying to work out how they would deal with Sinn Féin. Should we speak to them? At what level? Should officials in senior positions speak to them? Should junior officials speak to them? And there was meant to be a delegation from the council coming to meet a senior official, I think about prisons issues, and the government made clear that they would not be meeting the delegation if Mitchell McLaughlin was on this particular delegation. That led to Barra McRory, who is now, of course, our Director of Public Prosecutions, writing as the solicitor for Mitchell McLaughlin to very strongly object, to allege that this was illegal, that it was against the law. Ultimately, it didn't really go anywhere. The government said, we have very good legal grounds for this. He withdrew from the delegation, said, I don't want to stop this happening, it's an important piece of work, etc., etc. But if you fast forward to today, those two people are pillars of the Northern Ireland establishment, which we now have. Mitchell McLaughlin has just recently retired as the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly, a position in which I think he was pretty widely respected across the political divide for the most part. as I said, Baron McBride is now the DPP. He is the most senior prosecutor in Northern Ireland, and I think that is an example of something which is not a huge scandal. It's not something in these files which causes us to radically, I suppose, reassess our view of what was going on at the time, but it helps people today who maybe did not live through that period, and people like myself, or people who have forgotten about it, who maybe don't quite grasp the significance of that, just to have something more of a sense of where we have come from. The other issue which I picked up on, which is, again, in some cases rather, in some ways rather mundane, but I found absolutely fascinating just in the context of what I do in my day-to-day job, was about how the SDLP interacted with government, and this was a period of huge turmoil for the SDLP. The rise of Sinn Féin had obviously caused all sorts of difficulties. We now know that the Hume Adams talks were quite significantly advanced and had been going on in various iterations for a period at this point. But Eddie McBride was really enthusiastically briefing the government about just how bad John Hume was, how difficult he was to work with. There were late night phone calls. He was saying, phone me back after midnight, and I'm sure Hume will have phoned me by then. Hume hadn't phoned him by then, and he was very unhappy about it and said, I'm now going off on holiday and I won't be speaking to him until I come back. And I think that, in a way, is probably the sorts of things which are going on right now, and the government will be trying to understand what's going on within Sinn Féin and the DUP. Certainly, they have a certain understanding of that, obviously, from what happens politically, from what these people say, but I think it gives us a better understanding of just how political parties operate and the different cultures in political parties. It's very clear from these files that, for instance, that there was really very little, if any, official contact with Sinn Féin. We know that there were obviously other contacts in terms of the security services with various members of Sinn Féin at this point. But within the Ulster Unionists and the SDLP, there seems to have been this much more open culture where they regularly met ministers, met officials, had lunches, etc., etc., and were really quite open about what they were doing. To a lesser extent, the DUP had that sort of approach, but again, they were still quite sceptical of government. Some of them were interacting with government, some of them were not. The other issue, just which I thought was interesting in the context of where we are at the moment, is actually going back to something from a couple of years ago that was released. It was a whole debate within government about the Kincora inquiry. Again, something which is constantly, I suppose, coming back to the front of the news for all sorts of various reasons. But something which was a bit more significant, I suppose, and a bit more concrete in terms of something which was actually new, but it was showing that there was a great deal of debate within government as to whether effectively they could get away without having a full public inquiry into the Kincora situation. There had been several inquiries of various aspects of the affair, and really it was very clear from this that the officials were saying it was actually a slightly different piece of legislation to what now operates. It was a 1921 Act, but that showed that there was really a belief from officials that they couldn't get away from this. It was such a scandal; it had to be investigated at this level. Fast forward to today, what are we talking about? Over the last couple of weeks, should there be a public inquiry into the renewable heat incentive? There's huge debate, changing positions almost on a daily basis among some of the political parties in the executive as to whether that should be the case. And I think just coming back to where I started this, I think that this really helps us understand government. It sometimes shows government in a good light. It sometimes shows government in a bad light, where people have been lazy, where they have been feckless, where they have maybe not checked something out, where sometimes people are actually doing something which is borderline illegal. There was a case 2 or 3 years ago, I think, where a senior NIO official was openly considering with colleagues as to whether they should suggest to senior Ulster Unionists that they depose their leader, which is really quite a significant constitutional issue in a democratic society, that the government would be trying to do that. Having said that, it has to be said that a very senior official then said, absolutely not, this is not the way we operate. So I think there is great value to this, and it is something which helps us understand government, and it's something which to a certain extent holds government to account, not perfectly, because obviously government has a very significant role in the release of these files, in creating them and deciding what we actually get to see. But I think the volume of information which is released here makes it difficult, I suppose, for anyone in government to be absolutely sure that if something is in that system, that it doesn't eventually. And one of the, just finally, one of the issues I suppose over the next 20 years is as we increasingly move to a more digitised way of doing government, with emails, with instantaneous records, which are more easily, in some cases are more easily, can be more easily removed. In other cases, I suppose, are more difficult to remove because of the electronic footprint which they create. How does that operate? How do we go through people's email inboxes in terms of senior officials? How do we decide what is personal, what is the day-to-day business of government, which is not at a level that we ought to be seeing, and who has access to that, who makes those decisions? Do those officials make those decisions, and do other people come back after them, and maybe at the time or in 20 years' time, and make those decisions? There's lots there for the PRONI staff here to get stuck into, but that's really the gist of what I have to say. And Eamon now I think we'll have much more detail about what actually is in the secret files from this release. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam. Thank you very much indeed, David, for the invitation, and indeed to you and your staff for facilitating me over 30 years covering these files. I like to say I started in 1921. That was the first file I saw, the first file of the old Unionist government, and considering that, my wife thinks I don't look too bad, so there you go. But when I first came here, of course, massive closures of files in the 1980s. It wasn't until 1976 or 77 that files were first released under the 30-year rule. One or two historians saw them. They were very much about the sort of early years of the state formation, and indeed community divisions and political violence. And then they were sort of clawed back considerably. And it wasn't unusual when I started here in the late 80s to see a file, for example, Their Majesty's portraits closed for 200 years. They must have been very bad portraits, I used to think. And then you would see something with a quirkier title. It would say, Redistribution of Seats, Londonderry, closed for 200 years. And that kind of meant gerrymandering Derry, closed 1936. And one of the biggest stories we used to write for the Irish Times in the late 80s was really Some Files Closed. That was the most exciting one because you were speculating as to what was in them, what that sort of cryptic title actually conveyed. Now all of this changes in the late 1990s when suddenly in 1997 PRONI, the old Balmoral Avenue site, released very, very controversial files from the violent days of 1920 to 22, when 500 people died in this city at the birth of the Northern Ireland state. And we had files on the McMahon murderers, on border violence, on the Ulster Special Constabulary, on the IRA from that period. And that opened a loosening up, if you like, a much more accessible approach to files under new open government regulations. And I suppose like Sam and our colleagues coming in here now twice a year, as we move from a 30-year rule to a 20-year rule, we're trying to play catch-up. So we're here in the summer as well. A bit inconvenient, but that's it. We, I suppose, are coming off the back of the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. And I mean, it's only in the last few years, just to give you a quick précis, Douglas Hurd, very much part of the team that drew up the agreement, giving Dublin an entrenched role in Northern Ireland, the Maryfield Secretariat outside Hollywood, involving civil servants from the NIO and indeed the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin. And we can see in the files this year that the British insisted on a particular route for nationalist concerns and complaints because the Irish government could table concerns and proposals under the 1985 agreement, but they had to go to the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin and then be passed on to the Irish civil servants and then to their British counterparts and then to the NIO. And it was a very long-winded sort of procedure, which some nationalists obviously short-circuited, and they were going straight to civil servants. And there's actually a file on monitoring the movements of Dublin civil servants at Maryfield. Are they having contact with people in the wider nationalist community? And the conclusion generally is in 1988-89 that they're not, because they can only venture out. Remember the siege of Maryfield in 1986 by Unionists and Loyalists. They can only venture out really with their RUC escorts and RUC cars. And generally it's known where they go, occasionally to meet someone, a newspaper editor or a politician, but it's quite limited. But that's an issue here. And that reminds us really of the intense political violence and turmoil that followed the 1985 agreement. not just the City Hall rally of perhaps 500,000 Unionists reenacting almost September 1912 and the Covenant. But of course, the by-elections of 1986, which were triggered as a protest, a petition handed into Downing Street in 1986, unlike the Covenant, civil servants spent months, going over the signatures, were they forged, were they correct, were people forced to sign? All a fairly futile exercise because no interest was taken in the petition anyway. And then the reaction of Tom King, who arrives in September 1985, when the agreement has virtually been drawn up. It's a month from its launch. And King, as an entrenched Tory and Unionist, is horrified by the amount of facility given to the Irish government in the north. And he is trying to advise Thatcher and senior officials to roll back in the agreement. Then the workings of the agreement. How the Irish government have their own agenda. They're pressing for fair employment, which becomes a major issue in the late 80s, finally capped by legislation in 1989. Then they're pressing for symbolic changes. Irish bilingual place names, for example, the demolition of Divis Flats, parades, which are a current issue, particularly from Cree in these years, the issue of the UDR. And that kind of sets the scene for what's released this year. And in many ways, I thought the big story in the files was actually the UDR. A lot of concerns in the NIO about the role of the UDR, perceptions of the UDR, the involvement of a minority of its members in serious crime. At a time, of course, when by the early 1990s, 200 UDR men had been murdered, some on duty, some off duty, and that's part of the context as well. And the Irish government very much raising the UDR, Gareth Fitzgerald declaring in Washington in 1985 that 1/3 of its members are dangerous, but they'll very much be part of the Irish agenda. At the regular meetings of the Intergovernmental Conference, meeting by times in Belfast, Dublin and London in these years, where the Secretary of State, initially Tom King, later Peter Broke, is interfacing, of course, with Peter Barry from the Irish government, or later Brian Lenihan or Jerry Collins. And we have detailed memos of those meetings, briefing papers by civil servants for ministers. The Irish files are now being released from the 1980s, but we are actually up to 1990. So we're kind of lagging, they're kind of lagging behind us. And there are concerns being expressed, for example, among historians in the South, that, the full story isn't coming out, and therefore really the first draft of history is being written from a British perspective, in that you have the Stormont files, you have the London files, but you do not yet have the Dublin files. So there's a particular take on this being revealed, and that's an issue. And of course there's talk about emergency legislation. I wouldn't hold my breath, but historians would like to see those files out, obviously. And I said the UDR was the big story this year, and yet 1990, if we remember, was a year when 76 people died violently in one of the last years of the Troubles. The Stevens inquiry was very much in the news. It had earlier raided the homes of 28 UDR soldiers, causing angst among the UDR hierarchy, especially Brian Faulkner, the former Prime Minister's brother, who just died last week actually, Colonel Dennis Faulkner, who was a regimental colonel, who said that these raids, damage to houses, he alleged, put the UDR on the same level as terrorists, he claimed, and in the end there were only minor charges against some under the Stevens inquiry. But that is the tip of an iceberg, which emerges in these files. The reaction of the UDR as a regiment, founded in 1970 to replace the old B specials, initially about 9,000 strong. It had fallen back to about 6,000 by this period. Initially having about 20% of its membership strong from the Catholic community. They had disappeared with the outbreak of the Troubles, fear, intimidation, and it was down to 2% by 1990. And in these files we learned for the first time that the long-term British government policy was to phase out the UDR. That decision had been taken in 1980. They were surplus to requirements. They didn't need them. They were looking for an opportunity when the troubles perhaps subsided to perhaps keep part of them as a home defence force, a territorial army. But they said this must be cloaked in secrecy. This mustn't get out, or there will be a massive backlash from the Protestant community during this period. And in the wake of the agreement, there's one incident. It's funny how a bun fight concentrated British government minds more than anything else. And it really was a bun fight. Lord Lisle, who was a Scottish aristocrat and ex-Guards officer, had been invited to a regimental dinner at Ballykinder Camp by the UDR in November 1985. And he had a great military pedigree. He was also a Scottish Catholic peer. And suddenly, a week or so before the dinner was due to occur, Ken McGuinness MP contacted him to say he shouldn't come. He wouldn't be welcome. There would be a massive walkout. And then the Deputy Commander of the UDR, Colonel Harry Stevenson, phoned Lisle and said, "My lord, you mustn't come. It wouldn't be a good idea to come." So immediately you have massive hackles in the NIO, with Tom King expressing his deep displeasure through his personal secretary to the head of the UDR, and in private, Tom King and the British GOC saying there must be an investigation into the UDR. So that's a very interesting take in the files just released at this stage. The sectarian image of the UDR and the eyes of the nationalist community gets a lot of airing in these files. And indeed, one senior NIO official records how the Ulster Unionist leader of the day, James Molyneux, privately informed him, this man was called J.A. Daniel of the NIO, of his concern about the way in which some UDR patrols abused their position in relation to members of the Catholic community. There are a lot of private in-house meetings at this time between the Secretary of State, first of all Douglas Hurd, then Tom King, later Peter Brook, about the problem of the UDR and the perception of the UDR as alleged offences by UDR men, by a minority of course, many of them sectarian, are highlighted in the courts and in the press. And one of the murders focused on in these files is the assassination of Jack Keelty, a Dundrum, County Down publican. It was the father of the TV comedian, of course, Patrick Keelty. And it involved collusion, according to these files, between the UDA and a UDA leader who ran protection rackets, against whom Jack Keelty was a witness, and former members of the UDR. So that's highlighted in these files as well. You have the case of the UDR 4, initially arraigned and then convicted of murder. 3 of them released later after a campaign, which showed that the police had tampered with confessions. You remember that in the early 1990s. Peter Brook also concerned with the UDR, so that's a kind of a major issue in these files. He said, searching for his watch. But anyway, and so it goes on. It must be here somewhere, so I'll actually get the whole thing on. No. Keep me right then. And it's one big story of these years. Other stories, of course, come from an earlier period. We're seeing shenanigans at Stormont. I've seen this many times from the 1970s. Sunset on Stormont, question mark. I'm sure, Sam, that will inspire an article tomorrow. But anyway, it looked, Stormont, of course, had a previous incarnation as the power-sharing executive of 1974. And some files that were inexplicably held back, probably buried in some bottom drawer, have emerged which shed new light on that period. And it recalls, in some ways an age of innocence, where a gentle old Captain Cantillon was the sergeant of the mace. He was meant to deal with any uproar in that sort of strident assembly of 1974, if you remember it, with all the big beasts there, Aim Paisley included, Johnny McQuaid, ex-jungle fighter, Professor Kennedy Lindsay, who had a chair of history in a South African university and actually did, according to the file, an African war dance while chained to a table as the assembly dissolved on the 22nd of January, 1974. But a great account of that, where in fact, when the executive came in, the new executive led by Faulkner and Fit to take their seats, they found them occupied by guess who? Aim Paisley, Baroness Paisley, and members of the party. And of course they were then named by the speaker, because the mace was then grabbed by one of the vanguard members, passed among the members, and eventually the poor old sergeant of arms, who must have been in his 80s, seized it and brought it up to this weighty object up to the clerk, who then named certain members for breaking the rules of the House. And they had a pre-arrangement with the RUC that Superintendent Gray would lead his men in, but would initially try to use moral suasion to get the miscreants to abandon their seats. But if they refused, then strong-arm tactics would have to be used. And eventually, Paisley said, "It'll take the British Army to get me out of here." And eventually, of course, it almost did. It took about 30 policemen. He's finally carried out. We have the scenes of Paisley being carried outside, and so on during this period. So you have that interesting phenomenon. And then, of course, it was sunset almost for that assembly. It would, of course, collapse in the Ulster Workers' Strike of 1974. So it's interesting to get files from way back then. I suppose the funniest file I discovered concerned the GAA and Gaelic games, really. It comes from 1989, and the issue was a Gaelic football match, actually a Gaelic hurling match in Dublin. It was the All-Ireland hurling final of September 1989, involving, for the first time since 1946, Antrim. Well, it was a strong hurling tradition historically, playing a much more competent hurling side, Tipperary. And it was initially proposed that Brian Mawhinney, as an NL minister who frequently attended rugby matches, might like to put in an appearance, but he declined. And suddenly a note appears in the file from Peter Brooke, the emollient Secretary of State, saying, "Well, actually, if no one's interested, I would like to go, as an observer." And of course, this sends civil service kind of typewriters clacking in the NIO. Well, yes, it would be a good idea, but build bridges. But on the other hand, there is the ban on members of the security forces, joining the GAA. The ban on foreign games had gone in 1971, and this might, severely annoy the police and military. So it's been kicked up and down by various civil servants, and suddenly a memo arrives from the British ambassador in Dublin, Sir Nicholas Fenn. And Fenn took up the tradition of a colleague of his, actually, from an earlier period, Sir Brian McLennan, who had been the British ambassador in the 60s. And of course, he was a Gaelic-speaking Scot who knew all about shinty and had a deep interest in hurling. And for his 20 years in Dublin, he never missed a hurling match, even local games. And this comes out in the files. So Nicholas Fenn attended the match, but there's a whole backstory to this. First of all, he had to write to the GAA requesting if he, a dignitary like he, from a foreign embassy might attend. And he said there was a very much, there was a sort of a pregnant pause before anything happened. He was getting a bit worried. And then suddenly he got a gracious reply and 4 free tickets. And he learned from Dick Spring, the Irish Labour leader at the time, that Charles Haughey himself had intervened. He said, this man must be invited. Haughey was the Taoiseach in 1989. And he attended the match. He said he was in the distinguished visitors box, and he got a running commentary from a Fianna Fáil minister, and it was brilliant. And his account is unbelievable. He gets carried away. It's very good. I'll just give you a sense. He says this. He says, hurling is a fast and exciting game that was played with great skill, otherwise people would have been killed. Antrim was no match for Tipperary and were outclassed from the beginning. He noted that the outstanding Tipperary wing forward, who scored all the points, was fortunately named Nicholas English. He was Nicholas Fenn, and he was English. And he was a veritable Houdini, he writes, And he says his attendance attracted little attention. The thousands Surrey Road and the Hogan Strand didn't know he was there, but he said, Dick Spring tells me that some of the GA feared I would seek to present myself as the ambassador for Antrim, being the British ambassador to Ireland. And he says at the end, a marker has been put down and one small step has been achieved for Anglo-Irish relations. So there's a final note in the file, and as Sam will know, we have to wait till next year to see if this continues, in which there is a civil servant urging that the Secretary of State, Peter Brooke, should attend a local GAA game, possibly a schools match. And that's where we are. are at the moment on that particular file. We're talking a lot today about a hard or a soft Brexit in Ireland, and I was on Radio Wales yesterday morning recapping what's happening, and I happened to say at the end, and of course I said Brexit, the dog that hasn't barked. And they thought, this is brilliant. I've never heard this expression in their lives. I've never heard that one on the radio, you know. A dog that hasn't barked. But in fact, in 1988 to 90, the Irish government were actually involved themselves in enforcing a hard Brexit. And that is clear from these files. In fact, it began to annoy the British government to protect southern petrol stations and southern, if you like, retailers. The Irish government introduced unilaterally in 1988 a rule called the 48-hour rule. And it meant that anybody who went from Newry to Dundalk or Donegal to Derry to do a bit of shopping or to fill up had to stay notionally, legally, 48 hours in the jurisdiction of Northern Ireland to claim if you like, the benefits, the sort of tax holiday that this would involve. And this had been introduced by Dublin without consultation with London, and it emerged in a very interesting way. The Irish government in 1988 were very keen that the British government in the north should crack down on fuel smuggling. And they estimated that, you know, there were all sorts of ghost tankers along the border bringing millions of gallons of petrol into the south. The British thought the figure was exaggerated, it was really quite small. But the Irish government were pressing for a marker, a chemical marker to be put into fuel, which was imported into ports like Warren Point. It could be quite easily done, but it would cost in those days 3p a gallon, I think it was. And the British were under pressure to do this. Because the South felt they were flooded with smuggled fuel. But it also became clear that, and then they said there's the other sort of smugglers. And the British said, who are they? The characters who go north to fill up their tanks, they're smugglers as well. So the British looked into it and they realised this 48-hour rule was working. And they made it clear there was a very sharp exchange between Thatcher's private secretary, Charles Powell, and the private secretary of Peter Brook, to the effect that the British appealed it to the European Commission, they appealed it to the European Court, and the Irish government was found to have acted illegally in all counts in 1990. So just an interesting reflection on this hard, soft border idea as well. Over the years, of course, lots of focus by NIO officials, most of whom were English. I see a gentleman in the audience who told me how files used to be presented with UK eyes only on them, you know, which meant that if you were from the old Stormont Central Secretariat, you weren't to look at these files. This introduced in 1972. And among these, this privileged elite of NIO civil servants, they were always, of course, writing memos on the incoming Taoiseach. How flexible would he be? How good a working relationship would he have? Would he be in favour of extradition, which was a burning issue then, which Sam has picked up on in certain files, the Dermot Finucane file, or for example, cross-border security, which the Anglo-Irish Agreement was designed to improve. And there's an interesting discussion in Leinster, in the government buildings in Dublin in June 1990, between Dermot Nally, who was the Irish Cabinet Secretary. He featured, remember, in that drama about Charles Haughey a few years ago on television, and his British opposite number, really. Not his British opposite number, but a man called L.V. Appleyard of the British Cabinet Office. And they have a long conversation about Anglo-Irish relations. By 1990, the aim of the NIO was to involve the SDLP and unionism in talks, which might lead to the return of devolution and the watering down of the Anglo-Irish Secretariat and Intergovernmental Conference at that time. And they discussed this. The Irish government has been pressed to agree to a kind of a hiatus in meetings of the joint Intergovernmental Conference. And this is the issue. But there's a reference there to Charles Haughey, who has renewed, according to Irish officials, a good relationship with Mrs. Thatcher, who's now already in in her last year. And they said a recent meeting in Downing Street in the spring of 1990 between Haughey and Thatcher was, quote, just like a neighbour dropping in for a cup of tea. So there you are. Hopefully he didn't bring the famous silver Georgian teapot from the 1980 summit, which I think she later wanted to break over his head. But there it is. The RUC in these years opposed a return to the death penalty. That comes out very, they thought that it would add grist to the IRS mill and undermine moderate nationalism. Very strong memo from Jack Herman, Sir Jack Herman, the head of the RUC, on that, and so on in that period. And one or two other quirky things, I suppose, emerge in the files. One is, I suppose, SDLP tensions picked up by Sam as well. Obviously, John Hume had opened negotiations with Gerry Adams, private talks with Gerry Adams, around January 1990, within weeks of the Enniskillen bomb. The British were aware of these talks. They were on-off for a long period. And they had a final meeting in July 1990, and the British officials were wondering, was this the end of the talks? If it was, then they could fast forward the inter-party talks if they wanted to advance. The Unionists had said they wouldn't talk to the SDLP as long as John Hume was meeting Gerry Adams, and violence continued at this period. And John Hume, for the first time, raises the idea of a British declaration of neutrality. That comes out of these files very, very carefully. And you can see the first drafts of the Downing Street Declaration. You know, the idea that Britain had no strategic economic interest in Northern Ireland. They're being drafted in August 1990. Really, 3.5 years before the Downing Street Declaration, which was to unlock the potential of the ceasefire. So Hume is pushing for that at that stage, and the NAR responding with drafts that approximate very much to the famous declaration unveiled at the Christmas tree in Downing Street on the 15th of December 1993. And within 8 months we had the ceasefires, as it were, at that time. So that's very interesting in that respect. Tensions within the SDLP. John Hume very much kept his own counsel. There are obviously tensions between Hume and Mallon in particular, which have evolved more in southern files. I mean, these talk about tetchiness. Mark Durkin saying, John Hume's assistant, in one of the files saying that, we'll see if I can find what Mark Durkin said before he sues me, but Mark Durkin very much saying that Seamus Mallon has says things which were disgraceful and have undermined Hume at various points along the way. On the other hand, John McConnell of the NIO talks about meeting Hume and Mallon on a plane, and he says that they seem to be playing either hard cop, soft cop, or else Seamus Mallon was speaking a Dublin script to John Hume's kind of more international script. And he sought to play to Hume's international reputation, quote unquote. I reminded Mr. Hume just how far the Unionists had gone in the last 18 months. This saw the abandonment of, if you like, civil disobedience against the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and more of a preparedness by the DUP and the Ulster Unionists to engage in talks. And he said, and also that his reputation was very high in the community at large as a statesman who would take every opportunity to meet and discuss matters with political opponents. And you can see Hume mulling over this. There seemed to be a very good rapport between Hume and McConnell of the NIO, because later in a phone call from the Gresham Hotel, Hume talks about his poor relationship with Seamus Mallon. Now that's been highlighted in Dublin releases last week, which some of you may have read, when at a dinner party at the Irish Embassy in London, mediated by Noel Dore, the Irish ambassador. There's very much a divergence of view between Hume and Mallon on Irish unity and the perceived demand of the nationalist community, sitting at over 40%, then for a united Ireland. Hume says, no, he thinks it's more of a long-term aspiration, whereas Mallon thinks it's more immediate. And the Irish government saying we wouldn't want these differences to leak out. So this is 1990 as well, during that period. One other funny thing I'll say before we give you a chance to come back, and that is a remark which I think we all picked on by Ken McGuinness. I mean, these guys are lunched all the time by the NIO, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. Anybody who's spoken to by an official from Dublin or London can expect to appear in the files in 30 years' time, you know. They'll always write a memo, note for the record, they call them. And anyway, talking to Ken McGuinness, He's dishing the dirt on many of his parliamentary colleagues, but he comes to Willie Ross, who wasn't the most emollient of men. And when he says, Willie Ross, he said, and this is the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, he would stop political movement in Eastern Europe if he was there. So there you are. Thank you very much.